So one example is, let's say a baby is born and the doctors say it's a girl. And that baby grows up and identifies as a boy and a man later in life. That would be one example of what it means to be transgender. That would be an example of a transgender boy or a transgender man. As opposed to the term cisgender, someone who is cisgender is someone whose gender identity, so the language they use to understand themselves, the way they understand themselves, it does match the gender they were assigned at birth. So another example, let's say a baby is born, the doctors say it's a girl, and that baby grows up and identifies as a girl and a woman later in life. That would be an example of someone who is cisgender. Now, one of the reasons why I like to clearly define this term, and I do this for a lot of different trainings, not just the transgender specific trainings, but one of the reasons why I like to clearly define this term is because typically when we think about what it means to be transgender, we typically think of one very specific narrative. So I want you to think about maybe a movie or a TV show where you might have seen a transgender character on that movie or TV show. And I want you to think about what was their experience like as a transgender person on that TV show? What was their character like? What was their experience related to their gender? And typically, when we think about media representation of trans folks, there tends to be two different categories that we see represented above all else. And that is folks who are what we consider transgender male to female, or transgender female to male. So male to female would be someone who's assigned male at birth but identifies as female. Transgender female to male would be someone who's assigned female at birth but identifies as male. Now that is like one of the most common examples of transgender folks that we see in media. The reason I'm highlighting this is because while this is a very valid transgender experience, it's not the only transgender experience. And in fact, what it means to be transgender is actually broader than this. So there are plenty of trans folks who are male to female. We would call those folks trans women. There are plenty of trans folks who are female to male. We call them trans men. However, there are also folks who are non-binary and considered transgender. There are folks who might use language like trans-feminine or trans-masculine. But because they have a gender identity, so a language that they use to understand their own gender that is different than the gender that they were assigned at birth, they still fall underneath the umbrella of transgender, even if they don't fall into this very highly represented category that we typically see in movies and TV shows. So typically when we're talking about transgender folks, there is this word that comes up a lot, or this phrase that comes up a lot, which is gender transition. Now, if you think about those examples of maybe characters that you saw in movies or TV shows, typically those folks that are represented in movies and TV shows undergo what is the most frequently talked about or represented type of gender transition, and that is medical transition. So medical transition would be things like hormones and surgeries. Someone who is a transgender woman taking estrogen, someone who's a transgender man taking testosterone. That is the most common example of gender transition that we see both in like movies and TV shows, but also when we talk about like legislation, like bills that are looking to like restrict transgender folks' access to gender transition. They typically are restricting access to hormones and surgeries. There are actually 3 other types of transition related to someone's gender. There is a social transition, so when a transgender person changes their name, changes their pronouns. There is physical transition, so when a transgender person maybe changes their hair or changes their clothing. And there's a legal transition. An example could be someone legally changing their name, or someone legally changing the gender marker that is on their driver's license, social security card, or passport. Now, trans folks can really pick and choose what types of transition they want to undergo. The ultimate goal of gender transition is to align yourself with how you identify. So if you're a transgender man, you are assigned female at birth, who identify as a man, you might get on hormones like testosterone to grow facial hair and lower your voice pitch and impact your muscle mass. You might also change your name to a more masculine name. You might legally change your gender marker to male on your driver's license, social security card, birth certificate. You might also cut your hair to have a more masculine haircut. You might start wearing more masculine clothing. These are all examples of types of gender transition that someone can undergo and also does not have to undergo. So there are some trans people who maybe only change their name and pronouns, but they don't get on hormones, they don't undergo surgeries. There might be some trans people who change their name socially, but they don't legally change their name. So their driver's license has a name that is different than the name they go by. Someone who's transgender really gets to pick and choose for themselves what types of transition they decide to undergo or not undergo.